Johansson quote that was talked about a little bit ago is so pertinent to this room right now. I spent about 30 minutes talking to a number of people in the crowd here, and of all the conferences I've been to in probably the last 2 years, I've never seen such a diversity of thought, of roles, of positions, of industry, even within a conference that's specifically about beverage. So that's a testament to the First Beverage Group and Blue Box. Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me be a part of this. This is the type of energy that I love, that I feed off of. As a former entrepreneur, the idea of being in a room of so many diverse perspectives, ideas, and opportunities, it gets me excited. It brings energy to me and what I do. And that's also part of the reason I got involved in the agency space right after spending several years in tech entrepreneurship. It's because essentially we're allowed to be entrepreneurial for a lot of our clients who have a little bit of trouble in some cases doing exactly that and are trying to manage change and growth in a place where their competitors are looking at 10x and exponential growth. How do you compete with that? How do you compete in industries where fragmentation and unbundling of your industry is happening so rapidly? And when I got into the ad game, Sir Martin Searle had a quote that said, if Don Draper was alive today, he would recognize, he wouldn't understand 70% of what we do today. And that's absolutely true. And I actually know, as you can see, I've met the guy, spent time with him shortly after I was fired from the pilot. But that's true of most industries today. It's not just the marketing game, it's the beverage industry, it's the tech industry. There's so much change happening so quickly that it's the new normal. Change isn't just something that we expect, it's the acceleration of change. It's happening faster and faster and faster each day. It's happening at greater volume and greater scale. So how do you keep up with that? It's not something you can just hand to the intern who knows Facebook anymore. It's not just the person who has the relationships with the trade magazines that you can look and say, what's happening in my industry? It is an industry unto itself. So understanding what change looks like, what's the quality of the change that's happening to us, our industry, us as consumers, technology, that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And hopefully I can shed a light on some slivers of that change and maybe bring some light to what's happening. So I'm going to be looking at change in technology and what behaviors that's enabling for us as consumers and as people, because they're not the same thing. But also within the beverage industry. So first, we're going to be talking about how certain generations and certain demographics are driving the adoption of that change, both from a technology perspective and then also from the beverage industry perspective. So with that said, I'm going to start off by focusing on Generation Z. How many of you have a Generation Z at home? And yes, I'll refer to them as Generation Z because they're not. Okay, so there's about 7 or 8 people. So you'll probably be nodding your head quite a bit to a lot of this. By 2020, Generation Z will be 40% of the consumer base. For some of you, that's probably a pretty staggering thought. The idea that they're starting to become so much more, either both of the workforce, but also purchasing power. Many people still think of them as the tween who might have a YouTube channel. But Generation Z has an enormous amount of power in the marketplace, but also for the adoption of technology. They're kind of the epicenter of the adoption of a lot of technologies you're going to see here. And for them, the idea of something like linear TV or sitting down for prime time just doesn't even exist. On demand is just part of their culture. For most of the people in this room, that's probably also true. Looking at things like a cab, you just don't do it. You Uber, you Lyft, you Lime, etc. But for these people, they grew up with these concepts as the normal. There was no alternative, period. And for them, going with that linear progression, the idea of watching something at 7:30 on Thursday night doesn't happen. They look at YouTube as their remote. It's not just a place you go to learn something or type in a search query and watch a video. It is your source of content. For some of them, it's their babysitter. And 66% of Gen Z actually have their own YouTube channel. Whether or not they're posting anything to that is another story. But the majority of the population of Gen Z actually spends time with YouTube, has their own channel, produces content at some level. They're also redefining celebrity as a result. They're not looking at people like Brad Pitt as the quintessential Hollywood celebrity. They're looking at people like Jake Paul, who you see here. Any of you actually know who Jake Paul is? Okay, how do you like the guy? All right, he's kind of, that's kind of the universal consensus for anyone over the age of probably 15, and even for many of them. But he is a multimillionaire, makes significantly more than myself and probably most of the people in the room by kind of being an idiot on screen. And he gets paid very well for that. But he is the quintessential definition of a Gen Z celebrity. When people walk down the street and they see him, they go nuts. It's the same thing you would see for like a Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, anyone in the Hollywood celebrity and royalty you can think of. Along with that, they're also, their understanding of linear progression and just watching passively is completely different. Here, this is an example of a commercial for PlayStation, and you can see these things called contextual hotspots. What it does is it gives them control over the experience. And that's a common theme we're seeing in technology. They don't want to sit back and passively consume. They want to either co-create or control an experience that's been defined for them. In this particular example, you can click on any one of these and get more information on what you're actually seeing, so you can get more contextual information on that. Interactive TV, interactive experience. You can also do branching, so you can control the story and see what the ending will be. A choose-your-own adventure, if you will, kind of like the novels back in the 70s and 80s, put through to technology that's adaptable anywhere. Social messaging is another really important trend for them. Back in 2016, social messaging overtook traditional social media as the #1 form of communication amongst Gen Z and social media in general. The idea that we go on Facebook and we just broadcast everything we're doing anymore isn't really a thing for them. They want to have selective control over who they're communicating with, how they're communicating with them, and what they're saying. This gives them a bit of a safe space to understand who's going to see what they're saying and how they're going to be experiencing it. And as a result, it's also become a place for brands to be present and available for people, not just in Gen Z, but everywhere. In fact, over 84% of all Gen Z expect to be able to communicate with a brand 24/7. So not just that I can reach out to you via Twitter or call your hotline from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Central Time. I want to be able to talk to you at 2 o'clock in the morning when I have my craving for a cookie, and you better respond pretty quickly. YouTube also knows this. So they've actually added this type of functionality to their program to make it even stickier. And this creates a co-viewing opportunity for them. This is an opportunity for Gen Z to communicate with their fellow Gen Z within the experience of YouTube. Now, how many of you have seen a bunch of teenagers hanging out, sitting next to each other, texting and not paying attention to each other? We all look at that and say, man, how can you be so antisocial, right? I mean, it completely defies logic of what we used to do. We used to go outside, hang out. I rode my bikes with my friends. I didn't spend any time on the computer. I grew up without a computer. But for these people, you look at it and say, this is bad for us. What's actually happening is they're being surprisingly more social than any of us have ever been if you look at the volume and the quantity of those types of connections or relationships. Their definition of being social isn't bound by space. It's about their connection with the people who the message is relevant to and the moment is relevant to. That's still a hard thing for me to grasp and understand because I still have a little trouble processing why you would do that. But if you grow up with a smartphone in your hand, not knowing a world without technology, those bounds of understanding I can only talk to my friend Adam over the landline doesn't exist either. So your understanding of space and communication completely changes. They're also redefining sports. For a number of them, esports is becoming the fastest growing and most popular sport to play. A lot of people are actually abandoning things like football, lacrosse, hockey, basketball to play esports. And for many of them, it's extremely lucrative. Just don't be like this guy who actually threw a match and got 3 years in prison in Korea for doing exactly that. It's a $1 billion industry right now. In fact, more people watch the Dota finals than the entire NFL or NHL playoffs combined. By 2020, about 70 million people will be watching esports on a regular basis. That is more than soccer, baseball, and hockey playoffs all combined. That's a massive audience. That's completely changing the definition of what we know as sports. And just because they're mouse jockeys doesn't mean this is not going to be an important trend. And it's also very hot in the beverage space. The camera is the home screen. For them, the idea of passively consuming information, again, is just something you don't do. You want to be creating content, co-creating content all the time. You see this with the popularity of Snapchat, Instagram stories. When you open the app, the first thing you see is the camera. It's an invitation to create. It's an invitation to communicate with your colleagues. And we're seeing this more and more. In fact, 84% of millennials and Gen Z have interacted with some sort of lens effect or effect-based communication, which is something like a lens or an augmented reality filter on top of whatever image you have. You might see a lot of Gen Z just looking at the camera, fliping through filters for about 15 minutes at a time, finding the perfect filter and then sending it off. Pretty common behavior. But essentially, it's about an opportunity to enhance the content they're already creating. So as brands, this gives us a way to an entree into communicating with them as well by saying, we can help you create and enhance the experiences you're already working on creating. And Facebook and Apple are primarily the two companies that are providing these tools for Gen Z and millennials to do exactly this. This is an example of Facebook Studio. It's augmented reality tools that you can develop and essentially provide these frames and experiences for consumers. It uses facial recognition, machine learning to understand the context of what's in the camera so that you can create and enhance the experience you're already working with. Immersive computing. Going with the theme of augmented reality, these are opportunities to create a blend between physical and digital spaces. Many of you probably interacted with augmented reality in some form. These are examples of actually walking through portals. You can walk into the actual soccer game, and as you turn around, you'll still see the place you just walked through. But this is an opportunity to create new meanings of space, and it's something that the vast majority of Gen Z and millennials are already interacting with on a daily basis. Social VR. One of the biggest knocks of VR is it's a very singular experience. You put a headset on, you're kind of disconnected from the world, and you're no longer able to really interact with other people. Well, Facebook and Google are trying to actually create opportunities to change that. And what they're doing is creating things like Facebook Places, places where people can go and interact directly with other people one-on-one. It's their way of driving presence in a virtual and digital world. This example, we see a student actually getting help from a teacher in math class and office hours. And what that can connect to is actually her colleagues and other students can watch this via Facebook almost as a live video, as you can see here. Google's response to this is co-viewing. This is essentially an opportunity for a number of us to have our headsets on and share an experience of watching the same content together, but being in the same virtual space, whether we're physically there or not. Going beyond the idea of virtual reality, augmented reality, is the idea of voice and visual. One of the interesting stats is that 30% of all interactions by 2020 will be done through voice. And we're actually seeing voice queries searching up way higher than that, but it goes beyond just voice. Voice and visual and touch, multimodal experiences are becoming the way of the future. You may have trouble with Siri right now. I know we all do. But more and more of the way we interact with our digital surroundings is going to be done through voice. Google Assistant has an interesting perspective on this, and what they are doing is essentially providing access to their knowledge graph. They use machine learning and natural language processing to understand all of your digital ecosystem and provide things to you before you even know that you want it. And essentially, they're providing those connections across the digital ecosystem to make sure that you can get your Uber before you need it, and also be able to connect with all the things that Google can provide. So voice is going to be one of the biggest entrees for them. Beyond that, the understanding of voice being the predominant way of the future for Google also makes it so we have to understand the way that we're going to be marketing isn't just to humans in the long term. We'll actually be marketing to algorithms, as the future of search isn't about search or search intent. It's about providing answers to people's questions before they even know that they need those particular responses. Finally, machine vision. Machine vision is essentially a computer's way of understanding the context of what's around it in the digital world or the physical world. So very important to things like self-driving cars. Facebook uses it to understand who's in the image, who you might want to share it with. There's also really interesting implications for retail and beverage space. This is an example of a company called Poly AI, which is essentially providing opportunities and technology to retailers that Amazon has for themselves. If you've been to an Amazon Go store, there are a few of them around the country right now. You can basically walk in, pick something up, walk out, and you've paid. Well, what if you don't have the infrastructure of Amazon? These companies are providing machine learning and machine vision tools to give that type of opportunity to, and democratize it to the smaller retailers. You can see what they're picking up, how they're picking it up, whether they put it back or not, what they're actually doing. Are they actively contemplating a purchase? These types of things are contextual understanding provided by machine learning and machine vision. Intelligent cameras take us to another place. The idea that the camera is essentially a lens that provides new context to the world is creating, again, a blurring of that digital boundary between physical and digital. Google Lens has been an extremely powerful source of a lot of that content. And here you can see an example of being able to point at a flower and saying, what is this? It actually understands what it is, provides that answer to you. And same thing with the meatball shop. I don't know if any of you have been here on the Lower East Side. Awesome spot, great people watching. But if you point your phone at a restaurant, it gives you context, reviews, information. So the camera is becoming more than just something to capture and record. It's becoming a layer on top of our physical world that can give us context and information. So all this is great. A lot of technology, a lot of interesting stuff happening, but the most important thing about this is the people behind it. It's not that we just have this capability or that we have the opportunity to use this technology. If we focus on technology for technology's sake, we lose sight of what we're in service of. And that's in service of our consumers, the people that we try and serve on a daily basis. So it's not about tech, it's about our consumer. And at Epsilon, one of the things that we focus on is really understanding our consumers in a way that is difficult to do without massive, massive data sets. And instead of just understanding trends, we actually dive deep into this big data and the data of what we call data of culture through machine learning to understand how people are acting online. What are they doing with the products? Understanding themes, usage occasions of these products. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we do that and then what we've seen in the beverage space. So with machine learning, essentially machine learning it's actually modeled off of the way that humans learn. How do machines process data? Well, how do we learn, first of all? Well, we understand concepts through 3 different modes: experientially, communicatively, and conceptually. So an example might be as a child. As a baby, you might understand that the stove is hot by actually putting your hand closer and closer to the flame and experiencing that increasing heat. If you are unfortunate enough to actually touch the stove, you experience pain. And that is something experientially you understand. You're putting into your memory banks for a later experience. Visually, through your other senses, you might see that that metal is blazing red. So you're putting that in an understanding for future experience that blazing red means stove hot. That will probably cause pain. If your parents are doing their job, later on, you might be near, let's say, a campfire, and they would say the same thing to you of, hey, remember that experience you had with the stove? That is, if you're able to understand language at that point. Going too close to that might reproduce the same exact experience you had when you put your hand on the stove. That really hurt. And conceptually, you understand stove hot, fire hot, or that red color now indicates pain. Machines learn in very much the same way. We actually train them with enormous amounts of data to provide that context and that understanding. And whether it's supervised or unsupervised learning, they're able to parse through massive data sets to start to create those tags and concepts and conceptual understanding of whatever data we're feeding it. So communicatively, we could actually take a look at 2 different statements of, I went to breakfast with my family today, or I fed my dogs breakfast today. Those are 2 different statements, but they're essentially built around the same concept of morning activity, it's about nourishment. The audience may be different, but the machines would understand those are both situations in which you're actually talking about morning breakfast, feeding, nourishment. It's understanding those things conceptually so that what we can do is start to haul in millions of conversations and understand concepts, not just word linkage at this point. It's not like we're looking for specific words, but understanding the context of a conversation as a whole. And when you apply that millions and millions and millions of times over, you get really broad and detailed understanding of relationships, of themes, usages, and occasions of products. What it does is it turns the open web into the world's largest focus group. So whether we're actually going to Amazon.com and pulling down every single review on a particular product, or entire conversations around the NFL and sports teams, we can start to understand what people do, what they say, how they act, and the meaning behind those conversations. All of a sudden, we have this massive data of culture, not just data of identity. What do people do, say, and how is that culture born, and how is that culture changing? So what does that mean for the beverage industry? How do we apply this and turn these machine learning algorithms towards the beverage industry? Well, we've done about 40 or 50 of these in the last 36 months, and a number of them have been for the beverage industry. In fact, we've done some for beer and cannabis, understanding the the potential impact of cannabis towards mass beer, bottled water and tea, energy drinks, kombucha. We've also done coffee and liquor, a number of different liquor brands. But what we're going to talk about is some trends that have been derived from the data studying these particular industries and categories. And we'll get through some of the basic ones first, kind of the gimmies. Yeah, duh. Okay. At least we know the machines know what they're doing at this point in time. So refresh me. Summer months. Yeah, I get that. I'm looking for something to quench my thirst. I want something that's going to help refresh me, keep me cool. All right, treat me. Yeah, again, usage occasions. I'm looking for something that's going to be, maybe something special. Maybe add something a little beyond ordinary for my day, kind of taking me out of the standard funk. Okay, let's keep going. Keeping it healthy. Yeah, I get that. One of the biggest trends towards the conversation around drinks is about how do we keep traditionally not so healthy for you categories healthier for me. big move towards that type of trend. And just with the companies that are here today and a number of the other speakers in the room, you're seeing that trend just within this group. Category drift. This is where we start to have a little fun with it. Looking at these industries and starting to compare the data sets across each one of these categories, we're seeing some interesting category drift of things like skincare actually getting in the game of beverages. So that skincare is no longer just something that's an external application for health, but it's actually from the inside out. That's been pretty old news to the health industry, but for the beverage industry, which is almost the tip of the spear for most consumers to get into a lot of those spaces, this is really interesting. The idea that you can drink collagen and all of a sudden, from the inside out, you start to see the transformation of health and glowing skin. And that's something we're seeing not just within skincare, but a number of different other industries starting to get into the beverage space to start to bear out their own brand promise in another category. Innovation and personalization. Yeah, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with this. And yes, Dirty Lemon's in the room today, but this is the beverage space is hot and ripe for innovation. It's one of the places where people are actually looking for opportunities to find something new, to find something innovative and interesting. And this is one of the great examples of innovation and personalization, hyper-personalization. It's not done the typical mode of what you'd expect to go to a retail store or even buy online, but it's in its model, its delivery, but also its opportunity to personalize and also bring other industries to the table is really, really interesting and grabbing a lot of consumer attention. This is the only data slide I'm going to put on here, I promise. It's ugly, but there's a lot of interesting stuff on here. One of the things that we focus on when we talk about innovation and personalization and the advancement of industry, it's usually the younger demographics that get all the fun. What we see here is if we take a look at female Gen X, for driving a lot of these conversations, they're actually a massive opportunity for the beverage industry that doesn't get enough credit. There's also some interesting things happening around cannabis we'll get to in a moment. But ultimately, Gen X women are driving the vast majority of conversation online around, surprise, energy drinks. Not something we entirely anticipated, but massive over-index. Let's continue. Water and tea. Again, vastly over-indexing Generation X women. And finally, kombucha, which has also become essentially a status symbol. We unleashed our machine vision algorithms to take a look at thousands and thousands of Instagram posts to understand how people are actually portraying these products as well out in the wild. And one of the things we saw was kind of like the brag post, the flaunt post. And this here is one of my favorites of the steering wheel post. It's an understanding of a consumption occasion, but also kind of a status symbol. Look at what I'm about to do. Look at what I just bought. And this is giving us an understanding of behavior around a new and innovative beverage category. One of the things we found was that actually millennial men are also doing this quite frequently within the kombucha space. Not something we anticipated. The biggest surprise for us, boomers and cannabis. Boomers drove the vast majority of conversation around legalized cannabis and cannabis within the beverage space. And it's not because they were against the legalization. This is actually favorable conversation. We saw a massive spike in this conversation around 2015 with the advent of legalization in a number of different states. But they were really focused on understanding the space, understanding the experience of it. How do I go about understanding this? What are the opportunities? What's the experience like? If you compare it essentially to the whiskey boom of the last decade, in the beginning you had experience where people they like the brown liquor, but they know that there's more variety available. How do I find out more about this? You go to places where you have a guide. You have an opportunity to sample, to try, to experience. You might go to a place like Hardwater in San Francisco or Untitled in Chicago. You see 300 bottles of whiskey on the wall, but you have somebody standing in front of you and says, let me be your Sherpa. I will take you through these samples so you understand this. You understand the appreciation, the culture, and you can get through this experience from being a novice to appreciating, understanding its nuance. We're starting to see something similar within the cannabis space with brands on the rise. You've got brands like MedMen, which have become, essentially, they're trying to become the Apple of the cannabis space. They're creating opportunities for people to come into a space they're familiar with. It feels inviting, it feels modern, but at the same time, they're trying to create an experience around something that's new and novel to help guide people on a new and exciting journey around legal cannabis. So very interesting stuff around there. I know we're going to hear a little bit more about the cannabis space in a bit. But one of the things that we found that was interesting, we were looking at the potential threat of cannabis to mass beer. And we wanted to see, will people start to move to cannabis as a substitute for mass beer? And overall, the answer was essentially no. For those who are drinking a significant amount of mass beer, only about 9% of them said that they would be drinking less alcohol. And about 16% of them said they would be consuming more cannabis once it's legalized. So despite the fact that there's a new entrant, a new competitor for some of the enhancing effects of drinking certain beverages, there's not so much the competitive effect as there is potentially a synergistic effect, as we're seeing in the CPG space for the combination of those particular categories. It's huge for experience all over the place. It's an opportunity to transport someone to a place they've never been and really immerse themselves in the experience, whether it's a museum, a brewery, a plant, or even like taking them to a vacation that might embody the purpose of your brand, helping them live the brand experience and values. Those are things that you can do with augmented reality and essentially using the camera as a lens on the world. But yeah, you don't have to hop on a plane, fly out to see your brewery and experience anymore. People can understand what you're doing in that brand and what your values are just by coming to see you through their phone.